Okay, Genesis chapter 15. Genesis chapter 15 and verse 7. He also said to him, I am the Lord, who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. Title of the message this morning, Miracle Nation. A miracle nation. The world of Abraham's day, of Abram's day, was filled with paganistic idolatry. Remember last week we talked about the Tower of Babel. How God had confused their language and had scattered them throughout the land. They did not worship the one true God. Where? In the midst of this paganistic world, this paganistic society that had developed after the earth had repopulated, after the great flood of Noah's day, where is God going to find this promised seed of deliverance that He had promised? Remember, for the last 4 weeks, God has been taking us somewhere. God has a plan. God created man, we're told, in His image and in His likeness. God created the heavens and the earth. He did so with purpose. He placed Adam and Eve in the garden. We remember the story that Satan comes along, he tempts Adam and Eve, and they fall on their face. At that very moment, Satan usurped man's power to rule over the earth. But God made a promise. God promised a seed of the woman that would bruise Satan's head, that would deliver man from the curse that had fallen upon him. This promised seed would restore man's authority to rule over the earth. We've seen time and time again, from the beginning of creation, we've seen Satan steadily and continually making these plans and schemes in an attempt to overthrow the plan of God. He moved on Cain, who ended up murdering his brother Abel, who was defined by God as righteous. Righteous Abel, murdered by his wicked brother Cain. Of course, we know that God went on to judge Cain, and then we saw where God raised up another child from Adam and Eve named Seth to replace righteous Abel. But Satan didn't stop there. Satan continued in his efforts. He countered. You see, what we have going on here is a war between Satan and God. God makes his move, Satan makes his move. And so Satan then we saw that he countered by attempting to corrupt the seed, by attempting to corrupt the human gene pool, and we saw that he did this via the union of the sons of God and the daughters of men. What was the result? God judged the world again. God brought judgment upon the earth in the flood of Noah's day. Then, of course, after the flood, God commanded Noah to repopulate and replenish the earth. So Noah and his family began to repopulate the earth. Do you think Satan stopped in his attempts? No. We saw last week that Satan then raised up a man named Nimrod, who attempted to do what? To create a one-world government and a one-world religion. What did God do? He brought judgment again. God brought judgment. He confounded their language and scattered them, which we said was the beginning of all false religions. False religion continued to proliferate itself into a world of paganism by the time and day of Abram, who would eventually become Abraham. And so what we want to see this morning, the main point I want to get across to you is this. God chose a miracle nation to preserve the seed of the woman. God chose a miracle nation to preserve this seed of the woman that he had promised to man. Now, the first thing we want to look at is this. God had not been defeated, neither was he finished. God had not been defeated, and neither was he finished. God has a plan. So what did God do? God went all the way back into Babylon, where we saw this virus of false religion begin. God goes back to Babylon, and he finds this man called Abram. And he calls Abram to a very important mission. His name was Abram. He was from the land of Ur, which was in Babylon. And what did God do to Abram? God called him to leave his own homeland.
That's right.
Called him to leave his home, promising to take him into a land of promise. He would end up becoming the father of a nation. That nation you and I know today as the nation of Israel.
Exactly.
God would eventually change Abram's name to Abraham. The name Abraham actually means the father of a great multitude. And so from the loins of Abraham, God would establish this chosen nation whose mission primarily would be to preserve the seed of the woman. She would be a miracle nation. A nation that was birthed and brought about, established by God himself, a nation that would be distinct, a nation that would be separate from the Gentile nations of the world. And from her, from this nation, this miracle nation of Israel, the seed of the woman would emerge. Which brings us to this place and time where at the age of 100, Abraham fathers a son named Isaac. Guess what, or how we can define the birth of Isaac was actually a miracle birth. Remember, God had promised Abraham and Sarah that they would give birth to a child in their old age. What did Sarah do? She laughed. Why? Because in her mind, this was something that was impossible. That's why she tried to help Abraham out. Gave her maid to Abraham to produce a child, because in her mind, she was incapable. It was impossible. So Isaac was actually a miracle child that was birthed from a miracle nation. With Isaac came actually the existence of a new people. Hence, this new nation, this miraculous nation, Isaac was born without the taint of Nimrod's revolt in him. Isaac went on in time to become the father of Esau and Jacob. Jacob's name was later changed as well. His name, guess what Jacob's name was changed to? Israel.
That's right.
And so Jacob's name went on, it was changed to Israel, and Jacob ended up becoming the father of 12 sons who would become the 12 tribes of Israel. And with time, Israel multiplied. They grew in numbers. And it was through Jacob, it was through Israel that the seed of the woman would come forth and emerge into the world. And so the time comes for Jacob to breathe his last breath. Jacob rode up and he gave his children his last will and testament. On his deathbed, he summons his 12 sons. And specifically to Judah. He says to Judah, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. It would be from the tribe of Judah that the seed of the woman would be preserved, and through Judah, Christ, the seed, would emerge. This royal line would come through the tribe of Judah, and from the lineage of Judah would come forth the seed of woman, who you and I know as the Christ. So God had not been defeated, nor was God finished. God chose a miracle nation to preserve the seed of the woman. Second thing we want to see is this. God's people were then driven from the land of promise. They were driven into the land of Egypt. At first, due to God's blessings on Joseph, due to Joseph's position as the prime minister of Egypt, as he has been appointed into that position by Pharaoh, through divine providence, Joseph being the prime minister, the nation of Israel grew. They experienced blessing. They were blessed by God. They were blessed by Pharaoh even. But eventually Joseph dies. And with the death of Joseph, the blessings and the blessings of Pharaoh over Israel, those blessings began to wane. The Jewish people, eventually they were made slaves in Egypt. And Pharaoh had noticed that they were growing, and they were growing in numbers. And guess what Pharaoh did? He became fearful. I wonder where that fear came from. Yeah. So Pharaoh, he becomes fearful. And we know, of course, it was Satan who was instigating this fear within Pharaoh. Pharaoh's feeling threatened by this people, you see. They're becoming too big. They're becoming too powerful. So what does Pharaoh do? He attempts to annihilate them. He attempts to do away with them. You see the familiar story here? He seeks to annihilate the nation by doing what? By having, remember in the day of Moses, Pharaoh orders that all the male children that are born, they be killed. You see the plot? You see the scheme? Who do you think's behind it? Satan hadn't given up, has he? We know that Satan is the instigator here as Pharaoh seeks to annihilate the nation by having all the male children murdered at their birth. And then after some 400 years, God led Moses out of Egypt. Remember, he meets Moses at the burning bush. And at the burning bush, where God encounters, or Moses encounters God, look at, well, you don't have to look at it, I'll read it to you. Exodus 3, verses 7 and 8, the Lord says to Moses, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrow. They've been slaves in Egypt for centuries. Pharaoh's been using them as slaves to build his kingdom, to build his cities. They've been making brick for him. And through all of those years, in bondage to Pharaoh, in bondage to Egypt, Israel as a people, with a certainty, they have forgotten all about the God of Abraham. They've forgotten all about this covenant that God has made with Abraham. And so God's people were driven from the land of promise into the land of Egypt. God had chosen a miracle nation to preserve the seed of the woman. The third thing I want us to see is this. God brought Israel out of Egypt and then moved her forward. God brought Israel out of Egypt and moved her forward. Listen, folks, you and I are not moving things forward in God's plan and purpose. God is the one who is moving things forward in His plan, in His purpose, and in His time.
Amen. Amen. Praise God.
And so God brings Israel out of Egypt and begins to move her forward. He moved his people out of Egypt with a mighty hand, we see. 10 plagues of what? Judgment. God brings 10 plagues of judgment upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. He moves his people where? To the point of the Red Sea, where he opens up miraculously the Red Sea. He leads Israel through the Red Sea, and then he drowns Pharaoh's army in judgment. On the other side of the Red Sea, what does he do? He continues to move his chosen people forward in miraculous fashion. He even feeds them out in the wilderness with miraculous manna from heaven. The bread of heaven, which came down to give life and nourishment to the children of Israel, would one day be Jesus Christ, the bread of heaven, who would come down from heaven and give life to the world. Fed his people with manna from heaven in the desert. He even went so far as to miraculously knock down the walls of Jericho as he marched God's people into the promised land. Remember, along the journey, they stopped at a place called Mount Sinai. That was actually where they became the nation of Israel. That's where they became a nation of laws. Mount Sinai, we know that God gives to Moses the law. He gives him the moral law. He gives them their civil law. He gives them their ceremonial law. And so what does God's law do? God's law elevates Israel in moral character and in a spiritual sense. God now elevates Israel over all the Gentile nations. He makes it clear, these are my people. The first commandment that he gives to Israel is what? Thou shalt have no other gods before me.
Amen.
You see, the pagan land that surrounded the nation of Israel was full of paganistic gods.
Yes.
That is one of the great blessings that God has passed down to you and I from his chosen nation. The belief in the one true God that Israel gave to us and revealed to us as a nation. And it would be through this nation that God would one day bring his only begotten Son, the seed of the woman, into the world. Israel now, oh, hear this, folks. Israel now had become radically distinct from the Gentile nations of the world. Let me tell you what God has called the church to be, folks. God has called his church to be a radically distinct people.
Amen.
And the sad reality of it is, in today's modern age, especially in this nation, many folk can't tell the difference between a professing Christian and a professing sinner.
Exactly.
Praise God.
Sad, isn't it?
And where does Israel find herself? She finds herself surrounded by a hostile world.
Exactly.
You and I are finding ourselves increasingly surrounded by a hostile world. And so why? Why did Israel find herself surrounded by hostility. Why? Because it would be through her that the seed of the woman would come forth. And guess who knew it? Satan. Satan knew it.
Yeah.
Therefore, he continued to stalk her. He continued in his efforts to destroy her. He's still trying.
Yeah.
So God brought Israel out of Egypt and began to move her forward in his plan.